using his attempt to rig the Indiana map. Here, let's play this clip.
In Indiana, just a few moments ago, the Senate there rejected the congressional maps to redistrict in that state. A number of Republicans voted against that redistricting effort. You have spent a lot of time talking about this. The Vice President traveled to Indiana. What's your reaction?
Well, we won every other state. That's the only state. It's funny because I won Indiana all 3 times by a landslide. And I wasn't working on it very hard. Would have been nice. I think we would have picked up 2 seats if we did that. You had one gentleman, the head of the Senate, I guess, Bray, whatever his name is. I heard he was against it. He'll probably lose his next primary, whenever that is. I hope he does, but because he's done a tremendous disservice. I mean, think of it. It's a great place. I love the people there. They love me. We won in a landslide all 3 times. Got tremendous votes. I got record votes. And then there's no reason for doing that. And the Democrats do it to us, so I can't imagine that they do it. But I wasn't very much involved. But there's a man named Bray, as I guess, head of the Senate. Was that Bray? Is that the name, Bray? I mean, I'm sure that whenever his primary is, it's, I think, in 2 years, but I'm sure he'll go down. He'll go down. I'll certainly support anybody that wants to go against him.
Now, let me come with receipts, as we always do here on the...
Okay? So Trump is in full meltdown mode right now. I mean, a complete, unhinged, behind closed doors explosion that has the entire West Wing walking on eggshells. What just happened in Indiana has sent shockwaves through the White House. And people inside the administration are saying they haven't seen him this furious since the 2020 election results started coming in. This isn't some minor procedural setback or a temporary legal hiccup that his lawyers can spin away by tomorrow morning. This is a fundamental, devastating blow to one of the core pillars of Trump's second-term agenda. And the implications are so massive that even his most loyal allies are scrambling to figure out what comes next. We're talking about a situation where the President of the United States reportedly threw documents across the Oval Office, screamed at senior advisors, and demanded to know how this could possibly have happened in a state he won by double digits. The irony is almost too much to handle. Indiana was supposed to be safe territory, deep red MAGA country where Trump's policies would sail through without resistance. Instead, what just happened there has exposed a crack in the foundation of executive power that could bring down the entire house of cards. Now, look, if you've been paying attention to what's really going on in this country, you already know that you can't trust mainstream media to give you the full picture anymore. They'll give you the sanitized version. The both sides framing that treats obvious overreach as just another political dispute. That's exactly why we built this channel. To bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. We dig into the details that actually matter. Legal mechanisms, the institutional dynamics, the behind-the-scenes maneuvering that shapes everything you see on the surface. You want to stay ahead of the headlines and actually understand what's happening to American democracy in real time? Make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day, breaking down the complexities so you can see through the noise. Hit that subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth, this is your moment. Subscribe and become part of the conversation. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. A federal judge in Indiana, and we're talking about a judge who was actually appointed by a Republican president, just issued a ruling that completely dismantles one of Trump's most aggressive uses of executive power. The administration had been using a combination of emergency declarations and funding threats to essentially force Indiana state agencies to comply with federal immigration enforcement priorities. This wasn't just about border policy in the traditional sense. Trump's team had developed what they internally call the Comprehensive Compliance Framework, which was really just a fancy way of saying they were going to cut off federal funding to any state or local entity that didn't fall in line with their demands. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in grants for everything from highway construction to public health programs to education funding. The strategy was simple and brutal. Do what we say or watch your state's budget collapse. A specific case centered on Indiana's refusal to allow state law enforcement deputized as federal immigration agents without proper training, oversight, and legal protections. The governor's office had raised concerns about liability issues, about the potential for civil rights violations, about the strain on already stretched state resources. These weren't radical objections. They were the kind of reasonable administrative concerns that any competent state government would raise. But the Trump administration's response was immediate and overwhelming. Within weeks of Indiana pushing back, the Department of Homeland Security announced it was reviewing all federal grant programs to the state. The Department of Justice sent letters threatening to withhold law enforcement assistance funding. The Department of Education started making noise about compliance reviews for federal education dollars. It was a coordinated pressure campaign designed to make an example out of Indiana, to show every other state what would happen if they dared to question the administration's authority. And here's where it gets really interesting, because Indiana isn't some blue state stronghold where resistance to Trump is baked into the political culture. This is deep red territory where Trump won by over 15 points. Governor is a Republican. The state legislature is overwhelmingly Republican. These are people who voted for Trump, who supported his agenda, who believed in his vision for the country. But even they couldn't stomach what the administration was demanding. The Compliance Framework wasn't just asking for cooperation on immigration enforcement. It was demanding that state officials essentially become extensions of the federal government, subject to federal oversight, required to follow federal directives, with no meaningful input on how policies would be implemented in their own communities. It was a fundamental assault on the principles of federalism that Republicans have claimed to champion for decades. The lawsuit was filed by a coalition that included the state of Indiana itself, several county governments, and a group of law enforcement officials who argued that the administration's actions violated the Constitution, spending clause, anti-commandeering doctrine, basic principles of due process. They argued that the federal government cannot use funding as a weapon to coerce states into abandoning their own legal frameworks. They argued that emergency powers cannot be invoked indefinitely to address situations that don't actually constitute emergencies. They argued that the administration had created a system of punishment and reward that had nothing to do with legitimate federal interests, everything to do with political control. The judge agreed with them on virtually every point. The ruling is absolutely devastating for the White House. Judge Harrison, writing for the court, systematically dismantled every legal argument the administration had put forward on the spending clause issue. He found that the threatened funding cuts had no meaningful connection to the compliance demands being made. You can't threaten to cut highway funding because a state won't deputize its police officers as immigration agents. Those are completely unrelated programs. The Constitution requires that conditions on federal funding be reasonably related to the purpose of the funding itself. This isn't some radical new legal theory. It's been established constitutional law for decades. But the Trump administration apparently thought they could just ignore it and hope no one would notice. Anti-commandeering doctrine ruling is even more damaging. The judge found that what the administration was demanding wasn't cooperation, partnership, commandeering. Federal government literally taking over state law enforcement functions and requiring state officials to carry out federal policy. The Supreme Court has said repeatedly that the federal government cannot do this. It cannot force state officials to implement federal programs, cannot turn state employees into federal agents without their consent. The whole point of federalism is that states retain their own sovereignty, their own decision-making authority, their own ability to govern themselves within their constitutional boundaries. What Trump was attempting wasn't just aggressive federal policy. It was a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between Washington and the states. Here's the part that has the White House in complete panic mode. The judge didn't just rule against the administration on the specific policies at issue. He issued a preliminary injunction that bars the entire compliance framework from being implemented anywhere in the country. This isn't limited to Indiana. This applies nationwide. Every state that was being threatened, every local government that was being pressured, every agency that was being coerced into compliance, they're all now protected by this rule. The administration's entire strategy for forcing states to fall in line has been frozen in place. Legal reasoning is so comprehensive that appeals court judges are going to have a very hard time finding grounds to overturn it. People inside the administration are describing the scene in the Oval Office as volcanic. Trump apparently demanded to know how a judge in Indiana could have the authority to stop his entire national policy. He reportedly screamed at White House counsel that they had assured him these legal challenges would be easily defeated. He threatened to fire anyone who had touched the compliance framework, then reversed himself and demanded they find ways to implement it anyway, despite the court order. Senior advisors spent hours trying to calm him down, trying to explain that defying a federal court order would create a constitutional crisis that would make everything worse. But according to sources who were in the room, Trump kept returning to the same theme over and over. He kept asking how this could happen in a state he won, as if the political loyalty of Indiana's voters should somehow translate into judicial deference to his policies. This is where the institutional implications become so profound. What we're witnessing isn't just a legal setback for one administration policy, fundamental reassertion of constitutional limits on executive power that Trump had been systematically trying to erode. The compliance framework was part of a broader pattern, a consistent effort to concentrate power in the executive branch by using funding, regulations, and emergency declarations to bypass the normal channels of democratic governance. Congress wouldn't give him the immigration policies he wanted, so he tried to implement them through executive action. Courts kept ruling against him, so he tried to create facts on the ground that would be difficult to reverse. States pushed back on his demands, so he threatened to financially destroy them. It was government by coercion. This ruling says clearly and unambiguously that it cannot stand. Okay, let's break down what this actually means. First, Understand that the legal doctrine at the heart of this case goes back decades and has been consistently upheld by courts across the ideological spectrum. The anti-commandeering principle isn't some liberal invention designed to frustrate conservative presidents. It was most famously articulated by Justice Scalia, one of the most conservative justices in modern Supreme Court history, in a case called Prince v. United States back in 1907. That case involved the Brady Bill's requirement that local law enforcement conduct background checks on gun purchasers. Scalia wrote that the federal government cannot compel state officials to implement federal regulatory programs. Period. It doesn't matter how important the federal government thinks those programs are. It doesn't matter how much sense it might make from a policy perspective. The Constitution creates a system of dual sovereignty where both federal and state governments have their own spheres of authority, and the federal government cannot simply conscript state resources for its own purposes. Second, spending clause limitations that the judge applied are equally well established. The federal government has enormous power to influence state behavior through conditional funding. That's how we got the national drinking age, national speed, and countless other policies that technically remain state decisions but were effectively mandated by the threat of losing highway dollars. But there are constitutional limits on this power. The conditions have to be clearly stated in advance. The states know what they're agreeing to when they accept the money. The conditions have to be related to the purpose of the funding. So you can't threaten education dollars to coerce immigration compliance. And the financial pressure cannot be so overwhelming that it amounts to coercion rather than persuasion. What the Trump administration was doing crossed all of these lines. They were imposing new conditions on funding that had already been allowed. They were threatening programs that had nothing to do with immigration enforcement. They were doing it in a way designed to leave states with no realistic choice but to comply. Third, this is where the political implications become impossible to ignore. This ruling exposes a fundamental tension within the Republican coalition that Trump has been papering over for years. The MAGA movement talks constantly about limited government, states' rights, and getting Washington out of people's lives. But the actual policies Trump has pursued represent the most dramatic expansion of centralized executive power in modern American history. He has used emergency declarations to circumvent Congress. He has used executive orders to implement policies that couldn't pass through the normal legislative process. He has used funding threats to coerce compliance from states, cities, institutions that disagreed with his agenda. The whole apparatus of Trumpism, despite the rhetoric, is fundamentally about concentrating power in one person and using that power to override the democratic processes that might produce different outcomes. And now a Republican judge in a Republican state has said that this approach is unconstitutional. Political fallout is already beginning to spread. Republican governors across the country are quietly celebrating this ruling, even as they refuse to say so publicly. Many of them have been uncomfortable with the compliance framework from the beginning, not because they disagree with Trump's immigration policies, but because they understand that a power grab by a Republican president today can be wielded by a Democratic president tomorrow. If Trump can threaten to defund states that don't comply with his immigration priorities, what's to stop a future Democratic president from threatening to defund states that don't comply with climate regulations, or gun control measures, or abortion access requirements? The precedent being set is terrifying for anyone who thinks seriously about the long-term health of American federalism. And this ruling has given those Republicans a way to push back without having to directly confront Trump himself. Democrats, meanwhile, are treating this as vindication of everything they've been saying about Trump's authoritarian tendency, pointing to the ruling as proof that the administration has been operating outside the bounds of the Constitution, that the legal theories underlying Trump's executive actions were always on shaky ground, that the courts remain a check on presidential overreach even when Congress fails to act. They're already talking about using this ruling as a template for challenging other administration policies, other uses of emergency powers, other attempts to coerce compliance through funding threats. The legal strategy that produced this victory in Indiana is going to be replicated in courtrooms across the country. Every success makes the next challenge more likely to succeed. But here's where things get really dangerous, because everything depends on how Trump responds to this ruling. A normal president, faced with a clear legal defeat, would instruct his administration to comply with a court order while pursuing appeals through proper channels. That's how the system. Courts make rulings. The executive branch obeys them. And if the executive disagrees, it makes its case to higher courts. But Trump has never shown much respect for this process. He has repeatedly suggested that court rulings he disagrees with are illegitimate, that judges who rule against him are biased or corrupt, that he has the authority to act regardless of what courts say. And the people around him are divided between those who want to pursue legal appeals and those who want to simply ignore the ruling and dare the courts to do something about it. The scenario that has constitutional scholars most worried is one where Trump instructs federal agencies to continue implementing the compliance framework despite the injunction. Technically, this would be contempt of court. And the judge could hold administration officials in contempt, could impose fines, could even theoretically order arrest. But enforcement of contempt orders against executive branch officials requires the cooperation of other executive branch officials. Usually, the U.S. marshals, who ultimately report to the president. Trump orders his administration to ignore the courts and refuses to allow enforcement of contempt orders within genuinely uncharted constitutional territory. We're talking about a president openly defying the judiciary, asserting that his authority supersedes that of the courts, effectively declaring that the rule of law doesn't apply to him. Hypothetical fear-mongering. Trump has already been laying the groundwork for exactly this kind of confrontation. His public statements about the judiciary have become increasingly hostile. He has suggested that judges who rule against him should face consequences. He has questioned whether the federal courts have any legitimate authority to constrain presidential action. Most fervent supporters have been even more explicit, arguing that the executive branch should simply ignore judicial rulings it considers unconstitutional, that Trump has a duty to defend his view of the Constitution even if courts disagree. This is the logic of constitutional hardball taken to its extreme conclusion. And this ruling in Indiana might be the trigger that brings all of these tensions to the surface. The international implications are equally significant. America's allies have been watching Trump's approach to governance with growing alarm. This ruling is going to be analyzed carefully in capitals around the world. On one level, it demonstrates that American institutions retain some capacity to check executive overreach, that the courts remain independent despite years of political pressure. The Constitution still means something even when powerful interests want to ignore it. It's reassuring for allies who depend on American commitments and need to believe that the United States operates according to predictable rules. But the underlying pattern it exposes is troubling. The fact that a president would even attempt what Trump attempted, that he would try to coerce states through funding threats, that he would claim emergency powers to bypass Congress, that he would construct elaborate legal theories to justify essentially authoritarian governance. All of this suggests a fundamental instability in American democracy that allies cannot ignore. European leaders have been particularly outspoken about their concerns. They've watched Trump pursue policies that undermine NATO, that cozy up to authoritarian regimes, that prioritize transactional relationships over principled alliances. They've seen him use tariffs as weapons, threaten to withdraw military support, and generally treat international commitments as bargaining chips rather than binding obligations. Now they're watching him try to reshape the American federal system in ways that concentrate power in his hands and eliminate the institutional checks that have traditionally made American policy predictable and reliable. The ruling from Indiana doesn't resolve these concerns, but it does suggest that there are still forces within the American system capable of resistance. The economic dimension shouldn't be overlooked either. Markets have been nervous about the compliance framework from the beginning, not because investors particularly care about immigration policy, but because the uncertainty it creates is bad for business. Companies that operate across multiple states, that depend on federal funding, that need to plan years in advance for major investments, need to know what the rules are going to be. When the federal government starts using funding as a weapon to coerce policy compliance, states are threatened with financial devastation for asserting their own authority when the legal basis for federal demands is questionable at best. It creates an environment of uncertainty that chills investment and slows growth. This ruling provides some clarity, some assurance that there are limits to what the administration can do, and markets are likely to respond positively. Here's the bottom line. What happened in Indiana isn't just a defeat for Trump on one specific policy. Fundamental challenge to the entire theory of governance that his administration has been doing. The compliance framework was just one piece of a broader strategy to concentrate power in the executive branch. To use that power to override democratic processes and institutional constraints to govern by coercion rather than persuasion. And a federal judge appointed by a Republican president in a deep red state that Trump won by double digits said clearly that this approach is unconstitutional. The ruling applies nationwide. It freezes the administration's strategy, and it establishes legal principles that will constrain not just this president, but every president who comes after. The next few weeks are going to be crucial. The administration has already announced it will appeal, but the legal reasoning in this ruling is so thorough and so grounded in established precedent that it's hard to see how appellate courts could reverse it without overturning decades of constitutional law. More importantly, Trump's response is going to reveal a lot about whether he's willing to operate within constitutional limits or whether he truly believes his authority supersedes that of the courts. If he complies with the ruling while pursuing appeals, that's how the system is supposed to work. If he applies the ruling, if he instructs his agencies to ignore the court order, if he starts talking about the judiciary being illegitimate, then we're heading toward a constitutional crisis that could define the rest of his presidency. Keep your eyes on Indiana. But understand that what's happening there is about much more than one state or one policy. This is about the fundamental question of whether America remains a nation of laws or becomes a nation where power flows from one man's will. This is about whether the Constitution still constrains presidents or has become just a piece of paper that can be ignored when it's inconvenient. This is about whether the institutions that generations of Americans built and defended can withstand the pressure they're now facing. The ruling says those institutions are still standing, still capable of saying no to power, still willing to enforce the limits that make democracy possible. But the story is far from over. What happens next could define not just the Trump presidency, but the future of American governance for decades to come. Stay with us, because this is a moment that demands attention, demands understanding, and demands that all of us who care about democracy keep watching and keep fighting for the principles that make it possible.